And I want you to biblically try to discern this, try to answer this.
This question comes from an email that I received. I have a question for you. I thought on this for a while and have asked some elders I know, and I'm still unsure. I would love to encourage my brothers by sharing your answer. The question is this: how do pastors pastor each other when there is a plurality of elders in a church? So you get that. How do pastors pastor each other when there is a plurality of elders in a church? And then the question goes on, are there scriptures that speak to this? What does this look like practically? Are there any solid works, either books or sermons, that have been done on this topic? Thanks so much for taking the time out to read my question. So, what do you think? The question has to do with pastors being pastored. Does the Bible say anything about this? Is there anywhere in Scripture that you can think of that we might look?
With the overseer, so I think is it 1 Timothy 3 where it speaks about someone designed to be an overseer. Where is it? It was somewhere here, but anyway, maybe not. Maybe it's another part of Scripture. Anyway, isn't there a role of someone who like oversees elders? Or maybe not, I don't know.
Well, I guess the question is this: is there any place in Scripture that talks about pastors being pastored? I would say this: what Scripture does do is it sets forth a plurality of elders as the norm. You follow what I'm saying? Can you think of any place where we see a plurality of elders in a given church?
Ephesus.
We know there are a plurality of elders from Acts chapter 20. Anywhere else where we see plurality of, it's actually the term overseers in the text I'm thinking of. It's the introduction to Philippians. It actually speaks of the elders in the plural. Here's the thing. Can you think of any example in the New Testament where there's a church with one pastor or elder?
I can think of a few. I don't know which ones they are, but they were functioning as churches as far as I understand, yet there were no elders, but that's because there was like just a period of time, but I can't think of a church with one.
If there was one, it might have been the one Diotrephes was over, and he was not a good example, and he was not submitting to anybody, including the apostles. But no, here's the thing. The New Testament norm is a plurality. Now look, when you have a plurality of men working together to oversee a church, by that very relationship, there is going to tend to be accountability. And I recognize you can have certain men, and most churches with a plurality of elders it's not uncommon to have a primary preaching elder and even a primary leading elder sometimes. I mean, when you think about John MacArthur or John Piper when he was in the ministry, there's numerous examples. But one of the things that I found over here in the UK, and I recognize there's a lot of churches in the United States like this too, but the idea of one pastor is really it's really prominent. I think one of the things that we do need to recognize is that a pastor and an elder are the same person. A pastor, an elder, and an overseer are the same person. And we could look at the verses to establish that. They're interchangeably used. Now, I recognize every different church is going to have a different dynamic, a different chemistry among the leadership. You have guys that are younger, guys that are older, guys that are more seasoned, guys that are less seasoned. Some might be fully employed by the church. Some may not be employed by the church at all, and they have a secular job. And there's all sorts of factors that work into what the whole chemistry of leadership looks like. But the very fact that these guys are working together, there seems to be an indication from 1 Peter 5. You can look at 1 Peter 5. There seems to be an indication here about the nature of the relationship among the elders in a church. 1 Peter 5. Peter says, I exhort the elders among you as a fellow elder and a witness of the sufferings of Christ, as well as a partaker in the glory that's going to be revealed. Shepherd the flock of God that is among you, exercising oversight. Now, if you want to prove that elders are overseers, that is proven right here. The elder is told to shepherd, that's pastor, that's our shepherd. There is a verb that means pastor. Pastor means shepherd. And so the elder is told to pastor and he's told to oversee. There's no question that shepherds, pastors, and overseers are elders. And not under compulsion, willingly as God would have you, not for shameful gain, but eagerly, not domineering over those in your charge, but being examples to the flock. And when the chief shepherd appears, you will receive the unfading crown of glory. Likewise, you who are younger, be subject to the elders. Clothe yourself, all of you, with humility toward one another. And I think right there, clothe yourselves, all of you, with humility toward one another. God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. And it is thought that younger could be anybody that's younger in the church, or it could be the younger elders be subject to those who are older. That interpretation stands up in the original. And it seems like clothe yourselves, all of you, with humility is coming right on the heels of all this talk about elders. And the whole thing, basically, the whole thing seems to speak of a humility that is found in the leadership, and there's a submitting to one another. And so, when you have a plurality of elders, there is a sense in which, as you work together, it doesn't mean that men can't be strong leaders. It doesn't mean they can't have strong opinions. Good leaders are strong-willed, not self-willed. You got to make a distinction between them. Strong-willed. I mean, when they believe something is good for the church and good for the safety of the church, they're going to go to battle against wolves. They're going to stand with the flock. They'll die for the flock. They'll fight for the flock. And they'll fight bad elders if they get into the leadership. They're not going to cower from a fight. But at the same time, they're there's a humility where they're willing to listen to each other and they're willing to defer and submit to each other in different things. But of course, as George said, there's certain churches that don't have any pastor and they're trying to exist. The church, your church, existed for a season with no pastor. And then right now, as in the past, you guys really have never had a plurality of elders. And so you all don't, you haven't really been exposed to that. I was the only elder at Grace for about 2 years. And after that, we've had multiple pastor elders almost entirely throughout the remaining 17 years of the church while I was there.
It's probably important to note that, like, obviously a lot of us have been in churches where we did have multiple elders, but since being part of Grace Fellowship, we haven't had that. So some like all of us haven't had that.
Right.
Yeah.
So, I mean, how do you pastor each other? Let me just tell you something. The fact is that you full well know, with all the scandals that take place, one of the things that a church just needs to watch out for is the fact that its leaders have high moral caliber. Do you all recognize that when you look at the qualifications of an elder from 1 Timothy 3 and from Titus 1, all the qualifications, all of them have to do with the man's moral character except one? Did anybody know what that one thing is that's not moral?
He can teach.
He can teach. So aside from the giftedness to teach, everything else is moral. You know what? Brethren, you know this is true. If I simply took the money from the church and I was just verbatim preaching somebody else's sermons, and actually I just watched movies all day long, or I'm out on the golf course all day, not so much in the weather here, but pastors get away with a lot of things, crooked pastors. And the reality is this, brethren, the opportunity exists for me to be unfaithful to you. The opportunity exists. Brethren, for 19 years, the opportunity existed for me to skim massive amounts of money from the church. What you need to recognize is, if you've got crooked guys, they can find out opportunity. Now they may get discovered. There's no question about that. But brethren, you when it comes to pastoring pastors, one of the things that you really want to make certain of is that the chief shepherd is pastoring your pastor, and that he's walking close to that shepherd. Because you know what? When you have a man that's convicted that God sees him when it's dark, when it's light, he sees. I mean, I'll tell you this. We had the caliber of elders and deacons in San Antonio that were so meticulous that if one penny was out of place with regards to the budget, scrutiny went into finding where the mistake was. And we did end up having somebody skimming money from the box, but it wasn't any of the leaders. And it was a teacher actually in the school. But I'll tell you, the starting point is you want to be able to trust the man. I mean, that's just you, brethren. You may like Brother Joe. You may love his personality. You may like to be around him. He may be the greatest guy. He may be your friend. You may have known him for 20 years. But I'll tell you what, if he's got moral blemishes, you don't want him in the leadership. I'll tell you another thing. I can tell you that you looking at a man's wife is, even if he's got fellow elders and those fellow elders are able to pastor him and whatever, you recognize what that is, that shepherding. Well, they can do that through their preaching. That's one way we shepherd the flock. That's one. I mean, we give people things to eat. When you have a multiple elders, you can see if somebody's struggling or if something's not right in their life, or he comes to church all the time by himself, and where's his wife? Or his child comes in the back of the church all the time late and she smells like she's been smoking weed. I mean, you can see, you can watch for certain things. But I'll tell you, when a man has a conscience that is really aware of living in the sight of God, and he's got a good wife that holds him accountable. I know for myself, sometimes it's difficult when the men that you're pastoring with are younger or far less experienced. It can actually be helpful. Like, I found that some of my greatest input came from pastors and or missionaries from outside our church who were older than me. And so I think developing those kind of relationships, like you guys in the past, the Grace Fellowship Manchester actually had a situation where you had one pastor, and from the sounds of it, there was an expectation that he was being actually held accountable by folks that I don't think viewed the relationship in the same fashion. And when you're in that kind of situation and you're also distancing yourself from pastors in your own homeland, isolation is never a good thing. The Proverbs speak to that. You isolate yourself, that's not good. In some churches, pastors isolate themselves from the flock. In a lot of churches, pastors are untouchable. They're unreachable. You don't go to their house. You can't visit them. You can't hardly make contact with them. Sometimes you can't even talk to them. In some places, they have bodyguards, and some places they're just whisked away. And, having any personal time with them is next to impossible. But, there is a place for the church to keep pastors accountable too, especially, as you're involved in their lives. But one of the things too is that the church can do is really pray for its pastor. And they can pray that if anything ever comes up in the pastor's life that is sinful, that needs to be discovered, that needs to come into the light, you pray God would make that happen. God would protect the church and give good and godly leaders. And one of the things that the church wants to be doing is praying for a plurality of elders. I mean, a parity, Parity, a parity of elders. You want that multiplicity in leadership. It's safe. It's safe for a number of reasons. I mean, for one, there is that accountability. For two, if something happens and one elder gets put out of the church or dies, or there's continuity because you have other elders in the church, that plus Plus, it tends to throw a diversity of giftedness into the leadership. You don't just have one man with his set of gifts and his voice. You have some diversity there, and that diversity is safe, and it tends to be the standard that we find in the New Testament. But no, I don't really know of any solid works or books or sermons that have been done specifically on that. There are lots of churches where even if you have a plurality, I see churches in this country where you have a pastor and then you have elders. And so there's this hierarchy. The pastor is at the top and then the elders are beneath and the deacons are below that. Or sometimes I even see where, you have trustees, and it's just, and sometimes the deacons are trustees, and sometimes the deacons actually they exert almost more oversight than the pastor does. And anyway, there's a lot to be said for what I see in a lot of the churches here about just the structure of leadership. But we should be aiming at and praying towards the biblical model. And that is definitely a plurality. That doesn't mean equality. You say, what do you mean? Well, look, no two men are equal. You may be equal in the fact that we're made in the image of God, but by equality, I mean this. No two men are wired the same. No two men are gifted the same. No two men are the same age. No two men have exactly the same experience or exactly the same gifts, exactly the same experience. No two men have exactly the same availability. I mean, different men in the ministry may have all their children are grown up like me. Others may have, a house full of 6 children, and it just all those things come into play as to how different men have different levels of giftedness when it comes to leadership, to counseling, to preaching, to teaching, to admonishing, to the leadership, the oversight. Different men have different amounts of burden for missions, for evangelism. Different men are more of an evangelist, some less. It's just God owns different aspects, and it's not static. It's a dynamic reality, which means that the realities in men's lives are changing all the time. And so you shouldn't expect in the leadership just this static equality. That isn't the way you would want to view that.
Can I just ask a quick question in relation to that thing where the equality or lack thereof in the oversight itself? What would you say about an oversight where, let's say, just for the sake of argument, there are 2 elders, right? And one is much younger than the other, or one is much more mature than the other, and to such an extent that it's really the older or more mature elder that really makes all the decisions, and then the other one is just there as a yes man and confirming those decisions. And that could, of course, be extended to more than 2 elders, and there might be a few, and the same situation might crop up. And so I was just wondering what your thoughts are.
Well, I can tell you this, that I doubt, I mean, you can have some special circumstances, but here's a for instance. If I'm pastoring this work and a young guy comes along, for one, that young man, the way Grace Fellowship is structured, the way many churches are structured, that young man is not going to be brought into the eldership unless the existing eldership agrees that it should even go to vote, or however that in a lot of churches it's decided by the existing elders. In some that are more congregational, it's decided by vote. But to even get it to the place where it's being voted on, I mean, we don't necessarily have this totally established yet here. But in San Antonio, no man would be brought up for vote for the eldership unless the existing eldership is in agreement with that. Now, if the existing eldership just simply wants yes men and they're already in place, and basically the way the church is structured, no man can get into that position except through those guys, and they only are comfortable with yes men, then guess what? Your leadership is going to basically be filled with yes men. But if a man is wise, he's not just looking for yes men, he's looking for men who are wise, who bring different gifts and even possibly different perspectives at time to the table. But, you know, I think a young guy would be really foolish if he stepped into the eldership and once he got in, all of a sudden he just became a wild man, and, you know, he felt like he had to be heard, and he felt like the guy with more experience and everything, he had to resist him and fight him, and you know, it's certainly not wrong to voice differences of opinion, but, you know, one of the problems when you've got no matter what the age of the men are, one of the problems is if you've got an even number, whether it's 2 or 4. Obviously, if the numbers go up from there, the likelihood of a stalemate 50-50 becomes less and less likely the more you have. But when you have 2 or you have 4, you do run into, you know, obviously far more with 2 than with 4, but you run into the possibility of disagreements and stalemates. But what I have found through the years is we definitely, I mean, I was the first elder in San Antonio, and I definitely did not simply choose yes men. And we, you know, when you have a plurality of elders, you recognize, look, we're going to have disagreements at times, and you need to know when to dig in your heels and fight and when to defer to others. And the vast majority of time, one of the things is that we weren't all a bunch of yes men, or they weren't to me, but we did tend to bring guys in that had much the same theological perspective, much of the same missionary and evangelistic thrust kind of etched into their souls. And so when it came to doing certain things, it you know, there typically wasn't going to be a battle. Like, I would never want to bring anybody into the leadership that it was apparent from day one they're going to fight me on any number of things that I think are absolutely vital to the life of the church. I mean, I would not want to bring a guy in that was like anti-evangelistic and felt like, no, we're called to pastor. There's no place for the church to you know, be doing different things. And I've come across guys like that. I mean, if some guy came, I've heard of Reformed guys that don't believe the Great Commission is for now. They believe it was for the apostles. I would never bring a guy like that into the leadership.
Yeah, that's basically my question is provoked from, like, you you kind of addressed that misconception that some people have about you know, there being a pastor and then there being elders, and basically creating this hierarchy which is not biblical, and you know, them saying, oh well, the elders decided this, but then the pastor decided that, or the chief elder decided that, and then creating that tension there between elders and stuff.
But I know this. I know that it can create certain insecurities for a younger guy coming on board. Like, where does he fit? Especially if the church has operated for some time with one elder or with two elders or whatever, and then you add a person, you add another man, and there can be uncertainties about, well, where do I fit? What do I do? And I know something that's a massive mistake is to just carnally do something like, oh, well, we have two elders, so we're going to divide counseling up 50-50. We're going to divide preaching up 50-50. We're going to divide. See, that is not what you want to do. What you want to do is that's just doing it by the numbers. That's just doing it in a carnal fashion. We want to be led by the Spirit. And so we really want to give consideration to just where men are at and what their gifts are and what would be most profitable for the church. And because there's, I can tell you, at preaching at Grace for 19 years, I was the primary preacher there basically the whole 17 years that we had multiple elders. Well, at least in the last 15 years or so, the other elders basically would say that they believed that I should do the primary preaching. Now, we had a Sunday school there, so I basically set up the preaching schedule, and I sought to use all sorts of other men in the church to preach. But see, we had 2 sermons every Sunday, which we don't have that here. But if the elders would have said, if we would have got to the place where they said, no, we don't think that you should primarily be preaching anymore. Well, I mean, when I'm part of a body of elders, if all the others think that that's best for the church, I mean, you have to submit to that.
What about if there's a situation, right? So let's take you got King Saul. Now, obviously, the beginning part of his kingship, he wasn't really overtly, he wasn't trying to throw spears at David or anything like that. Outwardly, he would have been, upright to an extent. So let's say, they've got one wife, they don't drink, they're essentially like a Pharisee. They can keep the outward aspects. To what extent do you think? I mean, yeah. So, how much time has got to be given to really test out? So, the sermon you did the other day, where you kind of spoke about the things that Jesus says to the goats, the things that actually the good that they didn't do. How would one go about discerning essentially the inward aspects of a person's character? Because let's say, for instance, there are many people that can preach reformed doctrines. They can assert, they can affirm all the right theological truths, but then actually really their character says anything but the character and nature of Christ. But they may, and some could, there are people in those positions where that don't display those fruits. How would one go about so is there anything, because obviously there's the prescription that Paul gives here in Timothy 3, but is there anything further in which you would say a deal of discernment is kind of necessary to really to look out for those inward character qualities.
Well, and I would just say this to start. When you talk about elders, and this is an error that I hear sometimes alluded to. When you're talking about elders in a church, you don't want to talk about kings in Israel, because, and here's the danger. Somebody will say, well, there's David. David fell into adultery. David is approached by Nathan the prophet. David is basically forgiven. David goes on as king. So you don't want to use David or Saul or any of the kings, because kings are not pastors. If a pastor did what David did, he would be disqualified and out of the ministry. He would not continue on. And so that's key. We don't want to put those guys in the same category, even though that, yes, kings are leaders of Israel and pastors lead in the church, but that's not equivalent. That's not the same thing. So we don't want to make that error. But yes, we need, listen, I've been here since January on a more permanent basis. I've been rubbing shoulders and getting to know the church since March of 2020. And do I have an idea about different people's gifts? Yes. From my observations, I do. Do I have an idea about those in the church that may have unique gifts of discernment? Perhaps. So if I was ever going to get to the place where I was going to consider somebody seriously for the eldership, I'm going to go to people in the church that I believe have discernment and ask them what they think. And one of the things that we would do is, in the flavor of brethren, look out among yourselves and pick 7 men. I think that there's just absolute wisdom in involving the church in voting for an individual. Why? Well, because when you've got the entire church and all their different discernment, all their different perspectives on a man, that's very helpful. Because the truth is that the guy that we're considering, he may always put his best foot forward when he's with me, because he might be trying to impress me. And sometimes sometimes that's very obvious when you get guys that try to impress you. They want a position in the church. They're trying to put their best foot forward. They're trying to act like they know theology beyond what they do. They are striving to appear more godly than they are. But, there are times that, if they know Tim and Ruby are coming over, well, they got the house in order, and they got their kid. They've threatened their kids ahead of time that if you don't act right, and they, moved all the questionable magazines off to the side. But the reality is that, for somebody to really be involved in the life of the church, for them to kind of hide their true self from everybody, that's not likely going to happen. And so I think there's incredible wisdom in seeking the voice of the entire church. I'll tell you this: if a man, just from the gifted standpoint, if a man has a gift to preach, the church is going to know it. If the man says he has a gift to preach and the church doesn't know it, well, the man can think whatever he wants. But the fact is that a spiritual gift is a grace, and it's powerful, and it ushers in powerfully a channeling of God's grace to God's people. When somebody has a spiritual gift, when they exercise that gift, other people get helped. you know what? If somebody says they have the gift of mercy, but nobody ever thinks that they're merciful, well, they don't have the gift. No matter what they may think, no matter what they may say, no matter what they're trying to convince other people about, the fact is that if somebody isn't merciful, they don't have a gift of mercy. If somebody isn't giving, they don't have the gift of giving. If somebody doesn't exercise real lively faith, they don't have an extraordinary gift of faith. If somebody stands in the pulpit, or they try to preach, or they try to lead a Bible study, and nobody's helped, and people are confused, and the guy has no clarity and no ability to really deliver, and people are always wondering what in the world he's saying, and they're wondering how he's crinkling their eyebrows and wondering if what he's saying is even biblical. That guy doesn't have any gift. And now look, a guy can have a gift and be morally disqualified. But, you know, what, as somebody has said, I think it's funds, fame, and females. See how a guy uses his money. And I don't mean when he's watching. I mean, you watch him. You watch him when he doesn't know you're looking. And you see what he does, and you see how he lives, and you see how he handles finances. Because you know what? A guy that's selfish, a guy that's not giving, a guy that doesn't handle money well, a guy that doesn't have self-control when it comes to money, you know, that's problematic. You don't want that guy in the leadership. A guy that can't be trusted, a guy that, you know, a guy that gives his word and doesn't keep it. That's not a man. A guy that is not pure when it comes to women. That's really problematic. I mean, a guy that if you happen to stroll up to his house and you looked in his window and you find him watching movies that are absolutely inappropriate. I mean, these things are not just, oh, that might be a bad sign. Those things are absolutely disqualifying immediately. I mean, there's no question about it. I mean, you don't bend. Those qualifications in 1 Timothy are a must. That's what it says. That a man who desires that position must possess those qualities. And so you just want to watch, how does he handle his family? And so, you know, you want to talk to the people that are closest to him. You want to talk to his wife. You want to talk to his children. It doesn't necessarily mean that Scripture demands that a man be married, but if not, then you have to find out other ways. But you know, you'd never want to go down that path unless there was certainty. Putting men in the leadership is not a fly-by-night thing. I would not consider anybody for the eldership or for the mission field unless they had been at the church for at least 2 years. And you just want to see them. You want to see them day in, day out, month after month after month. Are they faithful to the prayer meeting? How do they pray? Are they faithful with their money? Are they servants? Are they giving themselves to others? Do they have gifts? Are they selfless? Are they sacrificial? Are they kind? Are they, you know, can they lead? Do people seek them out for counsel? Are they servants? Do people seek them out? I mean, are they evangelistic? You're just watching the whole time. What are the people made of? People can act for a day, they can act for a week, but when you watch somebody week in, week out, you watch them go through trials, you see them handle difficulties in their life, you watch them go through some kind of conflict or you know, some trial that comes into their life, you see what men are made of, you see what people are made of. And you know, nobody should ever get put into a position of leadership lightly. They need to be tested, they need to be proven, and they need to have the confidence of the body of Christ that's around them.
Yeah, I mean, with Saul, it wasn't so much it wasn't the link with him being king. It was just more to do with the things which are sometimes on the outward, which can see, yeah, but obviously you did address all of that.
Well, Scripture talks about sheep, wolves in sheep's clothing, and people can try to look like something on the external when on the internal there's something bad, vicious, animal, unsaved. What did Jesus say? Jesus said, you'll know them by their fruits. And if, again, I come back to this, watch how a man interacts with women, watch how a man interacts with money, watch how a man interacts with any degree of fame. Just watch him and look at the fruit in his life. Is there love? Is there an interest in the people of God? Because I mean, one of the great hallmarks in 1 John of somebody being a Christian is their love for the brethren. And you can tell when somebody's in the church and they're seeking position, they're seeking prominence, they're seeking fame. They don't really care about God's people. They want to be thought largely of. They want to impress people with their deep theological knowledge when really it's not so deep. The proverb says that a man is tested by his applause, and that's so true. Watch a man when he's applauded, and watch a man when he's not applauded. Watch a man when he's put in the fire. That really tells you something about what a man's made of. What I have found is people that are fake, when the times get tough, they tend to be all too quick to bail. What you want is faithful. That's what Paul told Timothy. Look for faithful men. What does faithful mean? Faithful means you can give a guy a task and he follows through with it. It means that he gives his word and he keeps it. Faithful. Faithful means he comes to the meetings. He doesn't easily miss them. He comes to the prayer meetings. He doesn't easily miss them. He's faithful. He's faithful to the church. Brethren, the reality is, like even attendance in a prayer meeting. I mean, it says volumes about where a man's priorities are. And you really want to see that. You want to see that you have a man that is going to stand by the flock. If the wolves come, he's going to stand by the flock, and with his life, he will lay down his life for the brethren. He will fight for that church. He will fight for its health. He'll fight for its safety. And he's not a lightweight. He's not a coward. He won't run. He will fight when it's demanded to protect the church. You want men like that. You want men that won't run when the going gets tough. You want men that they fear God and they walk in that fear. You want men that are praying men. And I'll tell you this, a man that's not a praying man, he won't be able to fake it. He won't be able to fake it in the prayer meetings. He won't be able to fake it in the preaching, because eventually the sheep can smell when a man isn't prayerful, when a man isn't, there can be some exceptional cases where men can deceive people and pull off deceiving them for a season. But typically the sheep have a way of, they just begin to recognize when a man is not praying over his preaching, when he's not praying for the flock. Oftentimes through the years, I can tell when somebody comes into a prayer meeting and this almost feels like it's the first time this week they're even praying. You can tell when somebody is, I mean, they're used to being in the presence of God, and you get a sense of that. And God's people have an idea about these things. There is a sensitivity. It's kind of like Jesus said, "My sheep know my voice." Well, the sheep know the men that the shepherd with that voice raises up and speaks through. But let me just say one more thing about this. Brethren, when we think about accountability, when we think about qualifications, brethren, pastoring is hard. Let me tell you something. We have at least 2 elders in San Antonio that have voiced to me in the last week that they want to quit. Now, I don't take them serious, but they're saying it because they think it. If I told you all the number of times over the last 25 years that I wish I had wings and I could fly away and be at rest, I can't number it. Brethren, again, I was reminded of this church down in Salford, down south of here, because I was with Jonathan Winch and the folks there from the church in Newcastle who have an affiliation with the church in Salford. But I was told that 3 of the 4 elders that have been involved with that work have had some sort of breakdowns. I was just speaking to a pastor friend in the US last week, and he told me that right now, where he came across this or what observation he even has to say what he said, I don't know where he got this. We were at the end of our conversation and he said this, and we both realized we need to have another conversation for several hours. But he made the observation that pastors, especially in the UK and in Denmark, they're having breakdowns and they're falling out of the ministry. Now, there's just such a volume of churches in the United States, but I suspect that if you looked at the numbers of men that are leaving the ministry, it's probably high. It wouldn't surprise me if it was high. And, you know, I remember Conrad Merle writing a paper and just saying that the toll that the ministry takes on a man is just massive. It can't be underestimated. And I just want to, I would just say to everybody that you do want to pray for your leaders, because the temptations that they're faced with, and the devil full well knows, you bring the leadership down, it's just it's like killing a general in a battle. I mean, you want to take the highest leadership possible out if you can. You know, one of the things that happens when you have a plurality of leaders is often those men are not just holding one another accountable, but they can be a support and an encouragement to one another. It can be, you know, it can be a tremendous help in the leadership when you're facing problems to share the burden among you. And I think I've mentioned that the church in San Antonio has been enduring some pretty difficult situations as of late, and they've got 3 men that are able to bear that load together, and that helps a lot.